Hello, I'm Jacqueline Holstead, and you are listening to On Point Conversations. In this podcast series, we share creative marketing, content, and branding strategies that help your business successfully navigate the new normal marketing environment. And you are listening to On Point Conversations. Today, I want to continue on the subject of rethinking, not second guessing, but rethinking. And I've been reading this book called Think Again by Adam Grant. I've also seen some other news organizations put out articles on this particular subject. Last time I talked about individual rethinking. So let me just recap that. And then today I'm going to be adding to that interpersonal rethinking. So now you're working with other people or one other person or several other people to rethink something, to relook at something. So when you're developing or when you're doing this as an individual rethinking, it's starting to develop the habit of thinking again. So thinking more like a scientist than making your assumptions based on opinion. And you want to define your identity in terms of values, not opinions. We talked about that. We talked about seeking out information that goes against your views, just to see what the other people are saying and to see where you might incorporate those. Being aware of not being on what I call the summit of Mount Stupid, where we don't know what we don't know, but we don't want to admit what we don't know. Harness those benefits of doubt. Embrace the joy of being wrong, which is a very hard one for, I think, anybody. Learn something new from each person you meet. Build a challenge network, a support network too, but a challenge network that you can actually rely on to challenge your thinking. I recently joined a writing group. I'm going to do NaNoWriMo in November, writing a novel in 30 days. And I started several writing groups, but this particular one I'm staying with, it's a small group. But it's also a challenge group. They're very supportive, but they're also challenging me, thinking about the novel I want to write, thinking about what I want to write about, how I'm going to put it together. So it's a really good mix of support and challenge. And the last point was don't shy away from constructive conflict, because conflict is going to happen. We live in a world, we will always have conflict of some kind or another. So it's important to understand that that's human nature and that we have to deal with it. So today I'm going to talk about interactive, interpersonal rethinking. So how do you work with other people to either move them to your point of view or to understand their point of view? So last time we talked about understanding other people's points of view. This time is getting them to understand your point of view. The first thing would be practice the art of persuasive listening. So, for example, when you're trying to open someone else's mind, we can frequently accomplish more by listening rather than talking. Because if you start out the conversation simply trying to get them to your point of view and you bring all these things up, you're going to create a wall immediately. If you start by listening to what they're saying, you're creating an open dialogue because you want to show interest. If you can show interest in helping others crystallize their own views and uncover their own reasons for change, it's a good place to start to increase your way or your addition of what you want to accomplish. Now, you start this by asking questions. Now, I had a person recently I was working with who asked questions before I was even done. So make sure you're listening first, because people can tell when you're waiting to ask your question and you're not really listening. The other thing you can do if you feel like you're going to forget your question is to just jot down a little bit that you might remember to go back to that particular question. So you want to ask better questions. You want to really get to the art of persuasive listening. You're listening to what they're saying and you're asking questions, good questions, that help them see maybe where there's a flaw in their thinking or maybe where there's a flaw in your thinking. Question how rather than why. Because when people start to describe why they hold extreme views, that really almost intensifies their commitment and they double down. They stop. But when they're trying to explain how they would make their views a reality, Then they start to see and can see the limits of their understanding. And you can understand the limits of their understanding. And you start to temper down some of those opinions. Because opinions are hard to change. We went back to individual rethinking. You want to think as a scientist. Here you want to look at, how is this idea going to play out? How is this particular change going to work? And start seeing where the process may be falling down. You might ask, what evidence could change your mind? What do you need to change your mind? Because you can't bully someone into agreeing with you. I mean, as a CEO or leader, you can bully people and tell them this is the way it is, but you'll have that underlying resistance to change, and you're going to end up with working through either them not doing what you'd like them to do, or resisting so much that they sabotage the whole idea. And that's not going to look good for anybody. It's really more effective to inquire about what would open their minds than to try to convince them on their own terms. Because, convincing them on their own terms is easier than trying to just convince them without having any of that in place. So what matters would change their mind. And ask people originally how they formed this opinion. Many of our opinions, like our stereotypes, they're kind of arbitrary. We develop them without rigorous data or deep reflection. So help people reevaluate, prompt them to consider how they believe different things, and then again go back to asking them what evidence could change their minds. Now you have to be in the right frame of mind to do this too. So when you're in the conversation, in the discussion, use these tools as you pull them out, as you need them. Approach disagreement like a dance, not a battle. You want to really acknowledge what kind of common ground you have. And we talked about that last time in change. The research shows that if you can keep some common ground, or you can keep something that they're familiar with in your change, you're more likely to have those changes be implemented and properly implemented. So try to get to some common ground. A debate is more like a dance. It's not a war. And admitting points of convergence doesn't make you weak. It just shows that you're willing to negotiate about what's true, and it motivates the other person to consider your point of view. In other words, you're compromising. Remember that less is often more. I've seen this in so many cases where a CEO will come in and they have a certain opinion and they want to do it, and they give about 10, 12 reasons why it should happen. So if you pile on too many reasons to support your case, and maybe you have a lot of them, but it can make your audience defensive, and it can cause them to reject your entire argument based on probably the least compelling point. So instead of diluting your argument, lead with a few of your strongest points. And let that sink in a little bit, because what is your strongest points? And if you don't have strongest points, maybe there's some things you need to change. Really be sure within teams and within other people, it's reinforce their freedom of choice. Yes, you come in as a leader, but and you want people to have a freedom of choice. Sometimes people resist not because they're dismissing the argument or they don't believe it, but because they feel backed in a corner and they feel they're being controlled. And no matter if you're the leader or the CEO, the people there do not want to feel controlled. So it helps to really respect their autonomy and remind them that it's up to them to choose what they believe. And it's up to them to help make this process work. So you're not trying to just be dictatorial. You're trying to work together in collaboration. This is an aside, but I was in a meeting just the other day where an individual clearly is leading this particular project. But she did not want to use the word leader. She didn't want to be called a leader. She wanted it to be called a collaboration of different groups coming together. And collaboration is good, but you always need a leader to lead. A leader doesn't have to be dictatorial, and it's how you define what leadership is. Because the best leaders that I've worked with are open to change. They're open to listening to their people. They're also readily available to listen, and they're also willing to set a limit. They're willing to say, this is what it's going to be, and this is where it's at. And when they do that, and people have felt like they've been listened to, and they put in their feedback, and they've been collaborating, been working with this person, they are more willing to accept the change, to implement it, and to work really hard to make it work. They're also more willing to come back at any point in time and indicate what about that particular systems or process is not working, and what ways they see that they can make it work better, because there's an open dialogue and there's not a dictatorial thing going on. So one of the things you want to do is have a conversation about the conversation. So if emotions are running really high, you want to try and direct the discussion to the process. Some people will say, well, let's just reconvene at another time. My concern with that is that then people become even more entrenched, and they might ruminate on it. It means they think about it and think about it and think about it, and they become more solid in the defensiveness. So you want them to work with you. So if emotions are running high, try to direct the discussion to the process, the facts. And like the expert negotiator who comments on their feelings, you might want to say, you might want to understand the other person's feelings. You might want to do some self-compassion. So you might want to think about how they're feeling and think about how you're feeling. And then you might share those feelings. Again, it's not a weakness in leadership to show feelings. It's a weakness in leadership to have a temper tantrum. That's not getting you anywhere. But to say, I'm really disappointed, or this is really frustrating, or do you feel this too? Do you feel like we're just at an impasse, and how can we get past this impasse? It is working together. And again, as I said, as a leader, we're not showing weakness when we work together with the people that are on our teams. We're showing that we're approachable. We're showing that we are the leader because we're willing to listen to different opinions and different facts and different evidence, and we're willing to take that into account in our decisions. Because if we don't do that, as I said before, then we have people who consider they can't say anything. And they, in a way, they might just still support you, but they're going to support you with what exactly you said, and that might not be the best solution. So as a leader, we want to keep our minds open. I do anyway. We want to keep open to what we're learning about what's going on. We want to listen, maybe more than we even ask questions for a while. Your listening and question ratio should be more listening than question-based. And ask questions after they've been able to express themselves. And some people are not quick on the draw. Like you might expect, well, I can ask a question, they're just going to immediately tell me. You might want to allow some time, especially for groups of people or maybe a person who is more quiet and more introverted and more likely to say, fine, I'll do whatever you want. But in a way will sabotage it, whether consciously or unconsciously, the choices that you want to make or the choices you think that are going to be good. Just reflecting a little bit on the changes in our marketplace, I was just listening to this news story this week about retailers who are having to rethink the return policy. They're still taking returns, but I guess last year at Christmas time or after Christmas time, there was something like $21 billion of merchandise returned. Now, granted, they can take that merchandise in. It should be in good condition. They can repackage it and sell it again, but they don't have the systems in place to handle these really big returns. So now some of the people, I don't remember the names of the companies necessarily, but they're charging a fee for returns. One place it was $8 for returns, one it was $4, because what people are doing in the advent now of COVID and of having, not to be able to get to a store, maybe the store is now just mail order, they buy something online, maybe it's a piece of clothing, and they buy several sizes because they don't know which size is going to fit appropriately. Hopefully sizing is consistent, but it isn't. Especially you'll find that in shoes and a variety of things, jeans, that kind of thing. And then they find which ones they try it out at home in the privacy of their own home, and they return what they can't use or don't want or doesn't fit. And we become very reliant on that. I know companies that have had free returns, Nordstrom's free returns. I don't know what they do now, but it costs money to have it returned. There's return shipping, and shipping costs are getting higher. There's need for more processes in place for what do you do with the returned item? How quickly can you get it repackaged? How quickly can you get it back into the store or back into circulation? So you're selling that piece of good. How do you make it? You might have to press it. You might have to launder it. There are different things you might have to do in order to get that piece back to where it should be or where it's going to be resaleable. Anyway, there's all that going on, and we'll talk about that more. In my next podcast, I'm going to talk about collective rethinking. So join me at that time. I hope you have a great day. And again, this is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me next week as we talk more about specific actions you can take to reach your own business goals. You can find my library of other inspiring podcasts like this one at onpointthinking.com. Again, thank you for listening. This is Jacqueline Holstead at On Point Conversations.